Hello everyone, welcome to the presentation of Program Vulnerability Repair via Inductive Inference. In this work, we investigate an approach to repair software security vulnerabilities using a counterexample guided inductive inference procedure over program states. This is a collaboration with colleagues from National University of Singapore and Beihang University, China. In automated program repair, one prominent group of techniques is constraint-based. In this line of work, a repair constraint is inferred at a fixed location, where this constraint serves as a condition under which the vulnerability cannot be triggered. Typically, with the original bucket program, a test suite, and optionally a fixed location, a repair or patch constraint can be inferred by either static symbolic execution or dynamic analysis from concrete execution of the program. With the patch constraint, a patch synthesis step can then synthesize a patch to ensure the constraint is always satisfied at a fixed location, yielding a number of plausible patches. However, challenges remain at the step of patch constraint generation. The static symbolic execution-based approach faces scalability issues, while these dynamic approaches may generate a constraint that actually overfits the given test suite. This means that the constraint does not generalize well to new test cases outside the given test suite, since these dynamic approaches rely on observations during concrete executions. Since the dynamic analysis-based approaches face the issue of overfitting the given test suite, one natural extension is to generate more observations outside the given test suite. One way to obtain additional observations is to generate additional test cases by fuzzing. However, there are challenges in using fuzzing to generate more observations and generalize them into a patch constraint. Firstly, since the repair constraint must be inferred at a target fixed location, the new test cases need to drive the program execution to reach the target location in order to obtain useful observations. Secondly, even if the test cases can reach the target location, it is also desirable for them to sufficiently explore the program state at that location so that there can be a higher quality generalization later on. To this end, in this work, we propose a method of using inductive inference to generate patch constraint, where the states can be explored more efficiently with direct state mutation during the program execution. Here, we use the term patch invariant and patch constraint interchangeably. In this inductive inference procedure, some initial patch constraints are inferred from concrete values observed during program execution. Afterwards, the procedure tries to find counterexample snapshots with respect to the current patch invariants. Here, a snapshot refers to a state at the target location, and it contains the mapping from variables in scope to their corresponding values. With these counterexamples, program states are then directly mutated into these counterexample states during program execution, and the program is then resumed to check the effects of these states on their program behaviors. In this way, new patch constraints can be inferred from a richer set of observations, and then the constraints can be refined. In this procedure, these new observations are obtained from both state level and input level mutations. With these main ideas, here is a complete workflow of the approach, which is implemented in a prototype called OneFix. OneFix takes as input the bucket program, the exploit input to trigger the vulnerability, and a given patch location where a patch should be applied. The first step of the workflow is to perform input level fuzzing to obtain a limited test suite. This initial limited test suite provides the basis for generating some initial and potentially overfitting patch invariants, which is to be refined further later on. The snapshot logging step then executes these test cases in this test suite and collect snapshots at a given patch location. The snapshots are then passed to an invariant inference engine, which attempts to infer a constraint or invariant from these concrete values. Next, from these current patch invariants, OneFix generates counterexample snapshots for them and store the new interesting snapshots for the next round of invariant inference. The new snapshots serve as new observations for the invariant inference engine, which may help to refine the current patch invariants. And this loop of invariant inference and counterexample generation forms an anytime algorithm. After a certain timeout is reached, the patch invariants are then used as final invariants for patch generation. Next, let's zoom into the major steps of the workflow for more details. At the first input level fuzzing stage, the purpose is to generate a test suite to infer initial patch invariants. In the current design, this stage uses a modified version of AFL, which is a grid box fuzzing tool. With some seed inputs, AFL forms a queue of candidate inputs to be mutated. For each run, some input from the queue is selected to go through certain mutations to generate a batch of mutated inputs, and each of them are then executed with an instrumental program to collect certain runtime information. AFL uses this runtime information to determine whether a mutated input is interesting, and if it is interesting, it is added to the fuzzing queue for further mutation. Since the purpose of AFL here is to discover more bugs, the interesting criteria is whether a mutated input increased the edge coverage of the program. But in our case, since it is desirable to have more test cases that reach the target location for the purpose of obtaining more values for inductive inference, we also mark an input as interesting if it reaches the target location. Such inputs are also added into the fuzzing queue. The input level fuzzing stage generates an initial test suite, which needs to be converted into snapshots at the patch location. To achieve this, each test case is executed with an instrumental program. The instrumental code discovers the values of left variables at the patch location and saves them. In addition, it also saves some other information. Since one fix targets security vulnerabilities, some variables that are absent in the program source code are also included in the snapshots, since they are likely to be relevant to the vulnerability. Such variables are called ghost variables, and the current design includes two kinds of ghost variables. If we assume a pointer variable is in the set of live variables, one kind of ghost variable is to include the size of the underlying memory buffer pointed to by this pointer, which is represented by this size pointer here. And the other kind of ghost variable would be the offset or the distance of a pointer variable to the base address of the underlying buffer, which is represented by this offset pointer. These variables can be useful in repairing memory-related vulnerabilities, such as buffer overflows. Finally, the execution result, namely whether the vulnerabilities is triggered, is also recorded to classify the snapshots into benign and vulnerable, so that a patch invariant can separate them. For the generalization step, an invariant inference engine such as DICON can be used. Here, the notion of patch invariant is slightly different from the usual likely invariant. The patch invariant should be satisfied by all the benign snapshots, and also additionally, at the same time, violated by all the vulnerable snapshots. Another possibility of generalization is to use a synthesizer, which can synthesize an expression that evaluates to true for all the benign snapshots and false for all the vulnerable ones. Both of these generalization steps can produce potentially overfitting patch invariants at this stage, since the observations so far are limited. In order to obtain more observations for higher quality generalization, we can directly mutate states to obtain more snapshots. This graph on the left illustrates the idea that input level fuzzing can be used to explore paths from program entry to the patch location, while snapshot mutation can directly explore the states over these already identified paths. During snapshot mutation, we are particularly interested in counterexamples, since they can directly refine the current patch invariants. Here, a counterexample snapshot is with respect to a patch invariant. For a given patch invariant phi, a snapshot is a counterexample if either it satisfies phi but the execution turns out to be vulnerable, or it violates phi but the execution turns out to be benign. So a counterexample here really means that what the current patch invariant suggests is different from what the actual program execution turns out to be. Feeding these new counterexamples to the invariant inference engine would result in an improved patch invariant that generalizes to more states. We also note that these direct mutation of states can generate infeasible states, meaning that the generated artificial states may not be reachable from any actual program execution. This diagram illustrates the possible category of states that can be encountered and demonstrates the effects of these infeasible states. Here, the inner light gray region represents all feasible states, and the outer region represents all possible states. The dark gray region represents the vulnerable states that are feasible, with the observed states from input level fuzzing and also the generated states from snapshot fuzzing potentially inferred classifier is shown as the dotted over here. Although the generated states can be invisible, the first observation here is that the patch invariant holds for both invisible states and visible states, meaning that it still correctly classifies the visible benign states and visible vulnerable states. And the second observation is that the inferred classifier can potentially disable more benign behaviors than desired. This is indicated by these two light gray regions inside the dotted oval, which are visible benign states but are classified as vulnerable. However, this is a limitation for inductive inference in general, since the classifier is inferred from what has been observed. With the generated patch invariant phi, OneFix currently uses it as a condition to generate simple patches. If a patch location contains an if, for, or while condition, OneFix tries to integrate phi into the original condition. Otherwise, it generates an if guard to prevent the program from executing with the vulnerable states. The implemented OneFix prototype was evaluated to answer the following research questions. Firstly, it is compared with other vulnerability repair tools. Secondly, we implemented two inference engine backends based on DICON and syntax-guided synthesizers, respectively, and performed the comparison. Lastly, we investigate on whether snapshot fuzzing is more beneficial than input-level fuzzing in generating interesting states for patch invariant inference. The benchmark used was created in a previous work, OneLog, and it consists of 39 C and C++ vulnerabilities, including buffer overflow, integer overflow, division by zero, and null dereferences. To evaluate patch correctness, we used a test suite generated by input-level fuzzing to validate the generated patches. For a patch to be correct, it should make all failing test cases pass, and should not change the behavior of the original program on the passing test cases. In addition, we perform a manual checking to rule out patches that remove functionalities. We compare OneFix with two other repair tools, CPR and SNX, on the vulnerabilities in the benchmark. A 30-minute timeout was used for all tools for each vulnerability, and the location of the developer patch was given to OneFix and CPR as the input patch location. The results shows that with the 30-minute timeout, OneFix generated more correct patches than CPR and SNX. For the second part, we run OneFix on the vulnerabilities, but with different invariant inference backends. One is DICON-based and the other is CVC5-based. DICON is template-based, where on the other hand, CVC5 is used to synthesize expressions with a given grammar. Since CVC5 has a more general search space and takes longer to produce results, a timeout of 3 hours is set for OneFix with CVC5. The result shows that, under this setup, the two backends generate a similar number of correct patches. Since CVC5 is more general, it was expected to be able to generate more complex patch invariants that are not covered by the DICON templates. However, we observed that this did not happen in the experiments, possibly because the more complex expressions also take longer to be synthesized. Hence, the CVC5 backend couldn't produce those results within the given timeout. Next, we compare snapshot fuzzing with input-level fuzzing to check whether snapshot fuzzing is more beneficial for patch invariant inference. Again, a 30-minute timeout is used for all runs. Here, OneFix C means that there's only a concentrated fuzzing procedure to generate a test suite, and the patch invariant inferred from this test suite is the final patch invariant. Similarly, OneFix A means that AFL is run longer to generate a test suite, which is then used to infer the final patch invariants. The difference between these two and OneFix is that OneFix allocates shorter period of time for input-level fuzzing and uses the rest of the time budget for snapshot fuzzing, while these two use all the time budget for input-level fuzzing. The result shows that OneFix generated more correct patches than only using input-level fuzzing, which suggests that snapshot fuzzing is more efficient in generating more interesting states for the purpose of patch invariant inference. In summary, this work proposes an approach to fix security vulnerabilities based on counterexample guided inductive inference, where the states used for inductive inference can be obtained from both input-level fuzzing and state mutation. This helps to alleviate the overfitting problem in APR without using a significant deductive machinery. Lastly, our artifact is available on GitHub and Zenodo. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you.